This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to a bumper edition of the US-China Trade War Update. I am Finbar Birmingham on the political economy desk at the South China Morning Post. It has been chucking it down cats and dogs here all week in Hong Kong, and the deluge of news stories shows no sign of letting up either. We trade journalists thought we'd been busy over the past few months. Then the World Trade Organization said on Wednesday, "Hold my beer." The dispute settlement body at the WTO ruled in favour of China in a case filed against the first two lists of Donald Trump's trade war tariffs dating back to July 2018. This was a huge global story around the world. Later in the show, we'll be speaking with Tatiana Prazeres, a former WTO official now working up in Beijing, to get more detail on what this ruling means, what it might mean for the future, and what the view is from where she is in China. Last week, we told you about the pushback the United States was facing domestically in its plans to roll out a ban on goods made using forced labour in Xinjiang. Earlier this week, these withhold release orders finally came to pass. But as we speculated last week on the show, they were in watered down format, targeting 5 Xinjiang entities rather than the feared ban on cotton from Xinjiang, which would have seriously upended the industry. The supply chain breathed a sigh of relief. For now, because there's likely to be more ahead on that front. We also saw the underwhelming conclusion of a top-level EU-China summit attended by Xi Jinping, Angela Merkel and others, with both sides still vowing to work towards an investment treaty but nothing concrete as yet. You'll hear from political economy editors John Carter and Zhou Xin on these issues on this week's show, as well as a couple of other nuggets from inside China's economy as ever. And in an added bonus this week, with all of the talk about decoupling, supply chain shifts and reducing reliance on China in the run-up to this year's election, I was really happy to talk with a businessman whose company has, for the past few years, been almost the embodiment of this debate under the Donald Trump presidency. H. David Murray is the president and CEO of manufacturer MGroup. In 2017, he had nearly 100% of his manufacturing in China. Now it's closer to 50%. He's going to join us on this week's show, find out more about his journey on this week's US-China Trade War Update. In what's been a huge week for US-China relations and for global trade, delighted to be joined once again with Zhou Xin, John Carter, our political economy editors here at the South China Morning Post. We're going to have a guest on in part 2 of the show to talk about all the stuff coming out of the WTO this week, guys. But that wasn't the only big trade story in town. Last week, we had discussed the possibility for a ban on products out of Xinjiang. The withhold release orders eventually came over a week after they were expected, and they were watered down. So what we got was partial import ban on products made by 5 companies related to the Xinjiang region of Western China. It wasn't as sweeping as we expected, John Carter, but the language by the CBP, the Customs Border Protection Agency in the United States, left it open for this to be expanded, and we do expect more movement in the future. Regardless of the nature of these bans, it does seem like in the case of Xinjiang and the United States, the direction of travel is very clear.
No, indeed. This is another gradual step in clamping down on what the United States alleges as human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And as you said, the head of the Customs and Border Protection Agency in the U.S. said that there's likely to be more to come. On the one hand, the United States wants to put a marker down that what's going on in Xinjiang is not right, and so there will be punishment. On the other hand, that they don't want to destroy the entire relationship, so they're taking what might be perceived as gradual steps. In addition, as you pointed out in your writing, Finbar, a widespread ban would have dramatic implications for the global supply chain in clothing because of the widespread use of Xinjiang cotton all over Asia. And so I think the U.S., one of the reasons it didn't go more strongly than it did is that they wanted to limit the economic impact.
Yeah, it was really interesting talking to people over the about 7 or 8 days between when the ban was expected and when it actually landed, the term that kept coming up in my conversations was this is a black box. I think business people in particular who are used to having great sort of relationship with the White House and with the US government, this to me illustrated how that has changed over the years. These people were as in the dark as I was. They were waiting to see what was going to happen from within the government. So that was a little interesting tidbit I took from that sort of that lag in time. And on a connected issue that we also discussed last week, the European Union and China had their high-level talks on Monday gone by. President Xi Jinping spoke with Angela Merkel, spoke with Ursula von der Leyen, all the top EU brass, and nothing really came of it. There were some positive statements and there were some commitments to continue working towards an investment treaty, but nothing concrete as yet. And again, John, this shows the EU were drilling down on human rights issues. So as Zhou Xin mentioned last week, this is China's worst nightmare, but it continues to unravel. The European Union and the US are now hell-bent on holding China's feet to the fire on human rights.
And human rights, as we discussed last week, is becoming a bigger issue and a broader relationship. It's in the trade, in the tech, and in this cotton ban, or partial cotton ban. In the meeting, or what we hear is in the meeting between Xi and the EU leaders, is that they brought up issue by issue human rights questions, and the whole purpose of this call was to try to bring China and the EU closer. China is looking to the European Union for a closer relationship, given the deterioration in the relationship with the US. And the EU said, yes, we'd like that, but only if we address these issues. The hope for an EU investment treaty, there was lots of nice rhetoric about it, but the negotiations have been going on for 7 years. And it's not clear if the EU's basic demands for a level playing field in the Chinese market are being met. And so it's, while they would like a new EU investment treaty by the end of the year, I would have to say that the odds are still against it.
Yeah, and from Stuart Lau's writing, our own Stuart Lau's, we know that Angela Merkel, who's going to be out of office next year, she's the main sponsor of EU-China relations and of this investment treaty. So the clock's ticking on that front too. Zhou Xin, was there any major response from inside China on the EU talks earlier in this week?
Okay, Finbar, things are very interesting in China because increasingly for Chinese talks with Europe or US, for the Chinese audience, they just receive whatever Xi had said. Whatever Merkel or the other says is very limited. But it's making very clear that Xi has told the European leaders that they do not want any teachers or coaches on human rights. And this is almost like saying, no, like we are willing to do business with Europe, but stop meddling our own affairs and stopping trying to lecturing me on human rights. And this was a headline on many social media, on any official media reports. China do not accept European Union as a teacher or coach on human rights. On the other hand, China is also playing up the message of by the end of this year, China and Europe should sign this bilateral investment treaty. However, people can see that this could be there could be lots of uncertainties because China has been saying about another trade pact, the RCEP, for years. But every year, we're going to sign this by the end of this year, and then the next year they say exactly the same thing. It's been going on for almost a decade now. So for the European bilateral investment treaty, people are waiting to see what will really happen. For analysts, I mean, if they look at these, what kind of agreement they have reached, I think many people do not have full confidence in the timeline because. From Chinese media, the only thing they agreed upon is this geographic definition. And you can see both sides are fanatically searching for something that both sides can agree upon. And this is not any breakthrough. Seriously, this is not about like state-owned enterprises. This is not about the government. This is not about reform of China's market. So this is a quite marginal issue, but they highlight it as one like important consensus. So this it itself shows that China and Europe can't agree upon more important issues.
Yeah, and Zhuxian, just to move on from the Europe issue briefly, we had when after he finished speaking with the European Union, Xi Jinping gave an interesting domestic-oriented speech in which he, as our headline said, he called for loyalty from the private sector. This picked up a good bit of traction on social media. Obviously, this is a sort of one of those buttons that people love to push about the state-led economy in China. What was your takeaway from Xi's speech on this area? What can we learn from this?
Okay, first of all, this is a big, first ever, the Chinese Communist Party, the Central Committee issued a united front work policy specifically for the private entrepreneurs. And then Xi Jinping has sent a message to a nationwide work conference, United Front Work Conference, specifically for the private business people. So this is quite important. And in contrast to the perception that, the Communist Party is trying to boost its influence in the private sector, is trying to control more of the private economy, I think that's the significance is actually the opposite. She doesn't need to push for that influence anymore. Even by official numbers, they're 9 out of 10 Chinese private businesses have already set up their Communist Party sales. Yeah, and those who don't set up possibly don't have more than 3 Communist Party members or whatever. But this Xi Jinping is doing this is to kind of an assurance or a promise to the Chinese private business people saying, you will be valued and your contribution to the national economy will be recognized. You are part of this, this whole nation building efforts, and we will treat you nicely. So this is like ideological efforts by the Communist Party to unite as a private economy sector, as Beijing is ready for a more hostile environment. Of course, as I said in the yesterday's story, the jury is still out whether Chinese private business people can trust the Communist Party. But whether they trust it or not, what do they do? What we can see is they are trying very hard to be close to the party as much as possible. We can see Jack Ma is a Communist Party member. Pony Ma is a member of MPC. Richard Liu, because of his sex scandal, was kicked out of the top political consultative committee, and everyone in China knows this is a loss. So putting the global context, it will be getting increasingly difficult for Chinese private businesses to separate them from the Communist Party, because this will be difficult also for our side, whether this is a genuine business decision or you have received some instructions from the Communist Party, in behind doors that we don't know. So this is quite interesting, and it also up to how Chinese private businesses manage this kind of relationship. One typical example is ByteDance, the TikTok. In the United States, I have to persuade Washington that we're completely independent from the Chinese government, right? We're a private business. We want to be global business, and we want to make money, and that's it. And but in China, they have to we are patriotic. We are loyal to the party. We're part of this efforts to building up, realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So this will be a kind of dilemma for many Chinese business to handle.
Yeah, that was interesting. Like the timing of this, the fact that it is in tandem with the ByteDance TikTok situation. Do you think that there's any overlap there in terms of why did the CCP decide to do this right now?
I don't think that's so specific, but the message is clear. I think the Communist Party is saying to the capitalists of the country, even we are Communist Party, we follow the Karl Marx doctrine that is at the end of the day, private ownership will be ended. But for now, for a long, long period of time, maybe 100 2 years time, we treat you as our own people, and we will at your back, when you see troubles abroad.
I'm sure they're all very reassured by the by the messaging there. John, I just wanted to briefly bring you in before we wrap up. The economic data earlier in the week was positive. Growth continues in China. Retail back to growth. What was your takeaway from that?
Well, again, it shows that the economic recovery in China is gaining momentum. As you noted, retail sales, which is a proxy for overall consumer spending, rose for the first time this year in August. And that's important because of the Chinese Communist Party's new dual circulation strategy, which focuses on the domestic economy. So with consumers resuming their spending growth, then that's important for the overall trajectory of the economy. Industrial production accelerated. Fixed asset investment was still negative for the year as a whole so far, but less than it was, and it looks like next month it'll turn positive. The OECD had its new forecast. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their new forecast for the global economy, and they said that China would be the only G20 country to post growth this year. So China is leading the world in growth, although the OECD warned that because of the nature of that growth and the world nature of the effects from the COVID-19 outbreak, that China would not be a growth engine the way it was back a decade ago after the global financial crisis.
This is an interesting point that's been made a few times recently, is that while China's economy has recovered, it's actually a drag on global growth. Is that the sort of messaging in that OECD report, John?
Not a drag, but they were saying it's not a locomotive either. It's more neutral. And that's not good for the outlook for global growth. Everyone expects an improvement next year, but still, it's going to take a number of years to get back to where we were in late 2019.
And of course, the usual debate followed the both the official Chinese economic data that came out on Monday and then the OECD report on social media, where people saying, you have to take these figures with a pinch of salt. My message is always, yes, of course, the concrete number is the actual number we take with a pinch of salt. But conversations with business people, factory owners in China do illustrate that the trend is clear. I mean, even if you don't believe the actual number, the direction is very certain.
At least so far. There is one question, and whether the strong increase in demand recently is just catch-up from the first part of the year when COVID ravaged industry, ravaged consumers, and whether that sharp increase in demand we've seen, particularly in car sales, whether that will continue. And if it doesn't continue, what it means for the outlook for the economy. Now, that is, I would say, is a minority view at this point. I think all of the indicators for China are pointing up at the moment.
Fantastic. John Carter, Zhou Xin, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're quite welcome. See you next week.
Delighted to be joined this week by Tatiana Prazeres, who is a senior fellow in Beijing at the University of International Business and Economics. Tatiana was previously a senior advisor to the Director General at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and she also served as a Secretary of Foreign Trade at the Brazilian Ministry of Industry, Foreign Trade and Services. So she comes with great pedigree, and we're delighted that she's joined us to talk about what has been a big week in WTO news, particularly in this part of the world. Tatiana, were you surprised this week by the fact that the WTO ruled in China's favor in a dispute case over Donald Trump's trade war tariffs?
Oh, hi, Finbar. It's a pleasure to be with you today. If I'm surprised, not really. I tell you why. The violations that resulted from the tariffs introduced by the Trump administration were really kind of a textbook examples of what you cannot do in terms of WTO disciplines. First, U.S. tariffs discriminate against one country. And of course, you cannot do that. That's rule number one of the goods agreement of the WTO. You should treat members equally. And then they are also violated rule number 2, article number 2 of the agreement on goods, which is you cannot go beyond your tariff level commitment, the commitment that you undertook when the WTO was created. So the US also went beyond that tariff level in introducing these tariffs against China. So it was not surprising. The question was, it was hard for the US to argue that these tariffs were consistent with the WTO disciplines. The question was whether they would find an excuse, an exception for them to justify their measures. And then that was the interesting part. So the US argued that their measures were justified by the exception of public morals. And I mean, that is a bit interesting, I found.
Yeah, it was a bit of a left field angle from which to defend this, right? Because they didn't actually dispute that it was against the letter of the law and WTO rules, but more that they had moral justification. Is that basically what happened, Tatiana?
Yeah, well, the agreement the agreement provides for that exception, right? So public morals is not just a moral kind of a justification that is established in the WTO and the goods agreement. I don't want to be very technical here, but there's a legal basis for you to argue that you deviated from the rules based on public morals. So there was a legal argument to be made. And I mean, U.S. lawyers are very good. I mean, I think that was the best that they could think of. And I don't blame them for arguing that, because really there was nothing else, I think, in the agreements that they could resort to justify the measures. But of course, the panel just didn't buy the argument. So that was that led to China's victory.
Yeah, the victory you mention is something of a hollow one, perhaps some would say, because in reality, there's not really much China can do with this, and maybe they can use it as a moral victory, and they can say, okay, the WTO says that we're in the right here. But is that fair to say, Tatiana, that it's a bit of a hollow victory?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think that's what it is. I'm just taking a step back. The WTO dispute settlement system is a two-tier system. So there's this panel stage, and that's where this dispute was just decided. And then if a member is unhappy with the ruling, it can appeal to the appellate body. And then of course, there would be a final decision on the issue. So the US has been consistently blocking the appointments of new appellate body members, of new judges, if you want.
Yeah.
And because of that, you don't have today enough sitting judges or AB members, appellate body members, to hear an appeal. So the US, by just exercising its right to appeal, it will appeal into the void, as we call it. So there would not be a final solution to the case, just because there is no way there's no appellate body to hear the appeal. And therefore, there would not be a final solution to this case. I mean, I'm assuming the Americans will appeal so that the case would be pending, right? And then, so China could not claim that they can that they have a final ruling on this issue, and therefore they cannot exercise their legal rights, for example, to suspend concessions or retaliate, as we call it informally. So all in all, you're right. It's a moral victory. I think they have the moral argument here, but objectively speaking, there's not much they can do, just because of what the Americans themselves did to the appellate body of the WTO.
Yeah, and is there some irony in the fact? I mean, if we do predict that the United States is going to appeal this, is there some irony that the United States, which has essentially hijacked the appellate body by refusing to approve the appointment of appellate judges, is there some irony in the US then taking this case to an appeals court that doesn't exist because it has been held hostage by the United States?
I think I couldn't have said it better, really. There's a lot of irony going on in these days in terms of trade policy, in terms of WTO, and this is one of them. I think it represents the contradictions and and all the drama, really, that the WTO is going on. So the US somehow hijacks the judges or the appellate body, and then appeals to an appellate body that doesn't exist, just to make sure that there is not a final ruling against them. And voila, that's where we are.
Certainly. But I won't mind, this is, if you look at the Trump administration's behavior over the past 4 years, this is not really something that's likely to deter Trump, Lighthizer et al. From the sort of trade policy they've been embarking on in the past few years.
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't think that will change U.S. behavior in any way. Or, I mean, if you want, there's a risk that this further emboldens, I think, the hawks in the U.S. administration, those that have been arguing that China benefits from the WTO, that unduly benefits from the WTO, that the WTO treats the US unfairly, blah, blah. So I'm not just minimizing the concerns that the US has with regards to the WTO. I'm just saying that's a narrative that is gaining force in the US, and this ruling could somehow strengthen the arguments of those who believe that the WTO has been treating the US unfairly.
Yeah.
The US has been, US representatives have been hinting at the possibility of the US withdrawing from the WTO, leaving the WTO. I don't think this particular ruling would make the difference, but somehow adds to this discomfort of some American officials with regards to the WTO. So it doesn't make a difference in the sense that it would not change U.S. behavior towards their policies, trade war, tariffs against China, tariffs that clearly violate WTO disciplines, etc., but may negatively affect U.S. disposition towards the WTO.
Yeah. Where does this fit in with the race to be the next Director General? Is this, I mean, it's already looking like a difficult job. Does this make it a bit more complicated?
I think it's a pretty difficult job. I don't think this particular ruling make it more complicated. It just adds to a scenario where these tensions between the two major trading powers have been affecting the WTO in a major way. I think the selection of the Director General of the WTO is something very important for the future of the organization. I think the WTO and WTO members are very fortunate to have very well-qualified names in the race, including very well-qualified women, I must say. But having said that, I think more than a DG, a Director General, I think the WTO is looking for a common purpose. What is that very common element that unite WTO members towards a goal, an objective, towards a common purpose? What is that? That used to be in the past, maybe trade liberalization, and if even free trade. We don't talk about free trade anymore, right?
Yeah, it's a dirty word now.
Yeah. Well, WTO reform could be that one thing that could unite members. But I mean, if you go beyond this slogan, members have very different views about what they want in terms of WTO reform. They're pulling the organization in opposite directions, in all kinds of directions. So I think the as I said, in addition to DG, or more importantly than looking for a Director General, I think the WTO is looking for a common purpose.
Yeah. Do you get a sense from your position there in Beijing that perhaps what China wants from WTO reform is different to what the US would want from WTO reform?
I'm very much convinced of that. I mean, the US sees WTO reform as an opportunity to constrain China, to constrain China's policies in terms of industrial subsidies, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of state-owned enterprises. And I remember the Chinese ambassador to the WTO saying, articulating very clearly, said, listen, to the rest of the membership, if anyone believes that by supporting the WTO reform, China would be accepting, to just put a straitjacket on, you'll be very much disappointed. China understands what the other side wants from the reforms. We want different things, but we want to discuss, what kind of common purpose, shared purpose we can find for this organization. So I think they have very different views about the future of the WTO. I feel that China is interested in discussing. China is open to discuss, to find, ways forward for the WTO to improve the organization, the function, the negotiating function of the organization, etc. Whereas I'm not that sure about what the US wants from the WTO and whether that can be consistent with what China wants. So that's a big question.
Yeah, and I have found in the interviews I've been doing with the candidates over the past couple of months, I mean, honestly, it's been very difficult to get them to say anything of real substance because of the fraught nature of politics today. Nobody wants to say anything that will offend either the US or China because they fear if you do annoy one side, your candidacy may be dead in the water. You've been involved with the WTO for in the past. You've followed global trade for many years, Tatiana. Is this a different sort of race than we have had in years gone by?
Yeah, I think it's different. Absolutely, it's different. I think in the past, candidates for the job of Director General of the WTO would be reluctant to somehow be perceived as being taking sides. You know, you want to be perceived as a neutral, honest broker, someone who could help facilitate the dialogue between among members. So, I mean, depending on the issue, you would feel the same. You would have the same feeling interviewing members in previous races. But now, I think as we miss that common purpose, shared purpose for the organization, it's even more difficult for the candidates to say anything really meaningful in terms of what to expect for the future of the organization. Just getting back to what we're discussing now, US and China have such different views about where the organization should go, where the organization should head to, that whatever a candidate says, it can be perceived as, leaning towards one or the other. I think this polarization that we see in politics in so many countries somehow is also seen in the WTO. Members have very different views about what the WTO should or should not be doing.
I was going to ask you about how closely you feel this race is being followed in Beijing from your colleagues and people you speak to, and how much are people how interested are people in this WTO ruling that happened this week in China's favour?
I think there's a lot of interest in China in the WTO. I think China has contributed a lot to the WTO, to the multilateral trading system, and China has benefited a lot from the WTO. China joined the WTO later, paid a high ticket price to join the organization, and of course is willing to enjoy the benefits of a functional trading system. So I think it is interested in the selection of a director general because, yes, the director general can make a difference for the organization. In the discussion, for example, about reforming the WTO, a good, skillful, talented director general can help shape the debates, can help somehow bring the membership together. So I think that is of interest to China. And with regards to the ruling that came out this week, I think there is somehow this sense of vindication. I think that you mentioned in the piece you wrote for this South China Morning Post, and that is shared by the academic community here who's been following the case as policymakers, of course. Having said that, I think people understand that how can I put it? The value of this ruling is somehow limited by what the US has done to the appellate body. So there's a certain realism, through which this ruling has been seen.
Certainly,
it helps with the moral argument, but it won't make a difference in the trade war in the bigger scheme of things, right?
Yeah, no, totally agree. That's what I've been hearing all week. Just to finish up, Tatiana, two quick fire questions. Who is your favourite candidate to govern the WTO, and who do you think China's favourite candidate is?
Really? That is a good question. Really, I don't have a favorite candidate. To be frank with you, I think it's time to have a female director general of the WTO. The WTO has never had one. And fortunately, luckily, we have a very good, very well qualified female candidates this time. So I think that's a moment for a woman to lead the organization. In terms of what China wants, I think China wants someone who's perceived as neutral, as trustworthy, as able, someone who has the skills to somehow operate in this difficult environment and bring the key players to the negotiating table and trying to make the organization work. I think China is very pragmatic in the sense that it understands that the WTO is transforming the way it does business. For the organization to be credible, to be relevant in the future, it has to do business differently. And China understands that and supports, for example, this, I don't want to be technical here, these plurilateral agreements where you don't have all 164 members, you have a subset of the membership, but those who are willing to move forward. So this is one thing that China is supportive of. But you need a director general who's not only politically strong, but also who's technically able to facilitate the conversations in a way that they are productive, fruitful.
Great stuff. Tatiana, very diplomatically and very knowledgeably put. So thank you very much for joining us on this week's podcast. Take care up there in Beijing, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
A bonus segment for this week's podcast. H. David Murray is the president and CEO of MGroup Corporation, a company that makes high-end furniture fittings for hotels and is headquartered in LaGrange, Georgia. I caught up with David earlier this week on a Zoom call to hear his story of what it's been like to be an international American manufacturer in the age of Trump. Back when Trump was elected, almost 100% of this company's manufacturing was based in China. Now, after a succession of tariffs and duties on products, he's been forced to gradually move parts of the production process into Southeast Asia and further afield. Here he tells me what happened when the Trump administration launched anti-dumping duties of 341% on quartz countertops from China.
So we got involved in that in the quartz industry in the United States that was importing from China ended up getting an average of 341% duties. And we started to look elsewhere and ended up, our quartz supply chain ended up with a Spanish fabricator owned by Italians living in Brazil. And our countertops were fabricated from that Spanish supplier in Estonia. We came up with a solution, and the only real winner was my frequent flyer program. Literally, my son and I, oldest son, traveled just about all over the world to find resources, and we've done so. And then the next blow was millwork cabinets, vanity bases, kitchen cabinets came under assault of anti-dumping because the political climate in the United States is really good for that, right?
Yeah.
And we now make our millwork in Malaysia. And so our pivot, we moved about where we were 100%, almost 100% Chinese in 2017. We're now probably 50 to 55% Chinese and balance in Vietnam, Malaysia, and Eastern Europe.
David explained that he suspected Chinese counterparts were getting around these anti-dumping duties by transshipment via Malaysia or Vietnam, then reboxing the products, sending them on to the United States. Or in the case of other products, adding a different customs code to the shipment, reliant on the fact that in the customs world, not everyone knows the difference between a headboard and a panel system.
A headboard over the bed is classified at a certain rate with a 202% duty. But a panel system has a far lower duty. So they'll reclassify it, misclassify it as a panel system, and it's coming through. So CBP, is Customs and Border Protection, is overworked. And if the paperwork looks somewhat good, then there's a good chance that these guys will get it through by cheating.
But rather than blame these individual manufacturers from China for circumventing the rules, David laid the blame squarely at the feet of the US government.
We want to play by the rules. I'm too old to go to jail, and I'm too old to pay a $30 million fine. And I'm not willing to take that risk. But unfortunately, many people are. And if you're sitting with 4 idle quartz ranges in China, and you've got 1,000 employees, and all of a sudden your number one market has evaporated, I don't fault them for coming up with creative solutions, but I do fault our process here in the United States of not knowing how to catch to the people in the business is obvious and flagrant cheating.
Yeah.
And if you're going to have a rule, we need to either enforce it or stay away from the sound bites.
Yeah.
And the sound bites is we're making these Chinese guys pay, and they're laughing all the way to the bank.
David doesn't want to take the remaining 50-odd% of his production out of China, but he may be left with little choice. He worries that in the current political climate, with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden wanting to look tough on China, his company may be forced to do so. Listen in here as David explains why he doesn't want to move that manufacturing out of China.
We have long-term relationships with our resources. They started as young, struggling businesses, just like we did.
Yeah.
And we've grown together, and we've made a lot of money together, and we've formed a lot of trust together. And we will do everything we can to continue to support these resources, unless it just becomes impossible from a trade standpoint to do so.
Yeah.
China is still the easiest place in the world for us to do business. It's a huge big box retail store.
Yeah.
You can get anything, in multiple choices of anything to produce, in your supply chain, your parts, your raw materials are all easily obtainable. And you try to do that same model in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Indonesia, which are essentially assembling areas, not manufacturing areas.
Yes. Yeah.
And the expertise is not there. The experience is not there. I go in my factories in China where we make furniture, and the average worker is 40, 42 years old. And I go in that same factory in Vietnam, and the worker is 19 or 20 years old. And the ability to produce and be productive and get the same level of productivity, you're dreaming if you think that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Now give us 10, 12 years, we'll figure it out. But right now, you're dealing with experienced workers, a skill set that's as good as anywhere on earth, and you're dealing with a supply chain that makes production and fabrication as easy and as efficient as possible.
Both Biden and Trump have really vowed to bring back manufacturing to the United States. And whereas that may be possible in some fields of industry, medical supply chain, drug supply chain, stuff like that, it's not really viable in other industries. And this is something that my conversation with David really reiterated in my mind. I asked him what he thought about this push to move American companies out of China. What does he think about this voguish term of decoupling?
It makes you feel like people don't really understand the nature of a supply chain, and that you cannot turn a supply chain making millions of dollars of anything overnight. It is a 6-month process. In the 6 months, if you're even up and running, you're ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Supply chains are global now, and you just can't turn them on a dime.
Yeah.
So if President Trump or President Xi, either one, come out and say, there's going to be a 200% duty on everything, for 6 months, be prepared to see higher prices, lack of supply, or people just cheating as much as they can, and the governments on each side looking the other way because they don't want to, admit that this policy is in the short run, very, very extreme.
And whereas the thought of moving back to America is a very nice one, it really doesn't work for his industry. I asked him to explain the challenges of reshoring to the United States, specifically to North Carolina, which was previously the home of the American furniture industry. And here's what he had to say.
Trump camp's not on this, let me give you an example. If a lot of furniture for the hotel business used to be made in the state of North Carolina.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was 20 years ago. And if the state of North Carolina offered me $5 million of grants to open up a factory in North Carolina today first of all, the worker that I'd find would be 68, 70 years old because they were the skill set. You know, the supply chain, who makes the hinges, who makes the boxes for the furniture, who does the stain, who does the finishes, where do I buy the equipment?
Yeah.
You know, it would take me 3 to 5 years if I were the best in the business to be competitive, and then my cost would be twice as high as a Vietnamese or Chinese supplier.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's some point where you just got to realize that in this global advancement of people, labor jobs have moved throughout time. When I was a kid, my cheap toys were made in Japan, and then it was Taiwan, and then it was China, and then it was Korea. And in the next 5 years, it'll be Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia or somewhere else. You know, this is an ongoing cycle, and it's been this way for forever. So right now, it's China's golden age of industrialization, but the United States had this age in 10 through 1925, and who knows whose turn it'll be next.
That was H. David Murray, the president of MGroup Corporation. Thanks to David for explaining to us the challenges he's currently facing. Thanks to Tatiana Prazeres for joining us to explain the WTO. And thanks, as always, to John Carter Joshin for explaining what's going on in China this week. This has been the US-China Trade War Update. I've been Finbar Birmingham, and thank you for listening. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at SCMP Economy, and I am on Twitter at FBirmingham. That's F Birmingham with a B-E-R, not like the city. We'll be back, same place next week. Until then, stay safe, wash your hands, keep your distance, wear your mask.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.